Welcome to Burning Platforms, our fortnightly look at the politics of technology, brought to you by Capita's Centre of the Public Square. I'm Peter Lewis. This week, we look at the intersection of privacy and national security with Miah Hammond-Errey. But first, our regular wrap of the latest news from Digital Rights Watch Chair Lizzie O'Shea and Health Engine CEO Dan Stinton. Well, welcome to another edition of Burning Platforms. What's the setup this week? Well, it's been a fortnight since the US election and Silicon Valley's spectacular victory. Elon Musk has turned an arm of government into his favourite Bitcoin, while Peter Thiel and Mark Andreessen are getting ready to maximise their return on investment after sponsoring JD Vance into the vice presidency. So what this means for the antitrust cases against big tech, AI regulation and crypto is yet to be determined, but it feels like the era of guardrails may be over before it really began. Meanwhile, in Australia, there is bipartisan support for a half-baked law to get tough on big tech as the rest of the government's tech agenda hits the wall. It just feels to me like everything is just amped up a notch. Or am I catastrophising because it's been a long and frustrating year? So to help me recenter myself and try to find some upside, it's great to have our regular panelists back together again. Digital Rights Watch Chair Lizzie O'Shea, back from her travels. Welcome home, Lizzie.
Thank you. Good to be here.
And always on the fly, Health Engine CEO Dan Stinton from some frequent flyer lounge somewhere in Australia. Hi, Dan.
G'day, Peter.
Also joining us for our deep dive this week is host of the Technology and Security podcast and founding CEO of Strat Futures, Miah Hammond-Errey. Welcome, Miah, and we do look forward to talking about your work in our deep dive.
Thanks for having me.
Let's kick off with a bit of good news, albeit belated. Privacy Commissioner Carly Kind has handed down a ruling that Bunnings breached the law over its surveillance of hundreds of thousands of customers using facial recognition technology in their stores. The case came to light a couple of years ago when our friends at Choice noticed a very small sign in the back of a warehouse, very quietly informing customers that they were being filmed as part of a trial. Lizzie, what has the Privacy Commissioner ruled and what does it mean?
So the Privacy Commissioner has handed down a determination in respect of the complaint brought by Choice, and I think it's a credit to Choice for having the foresight to bring a complaint like this, even though it's taken quite a number of years to resolve. It is a good outcome and pushes our understanding of our current privacy laws forward. It's about the use of facial recognition technology. So Bunnings essentially claims that it uses FRT, facial recognition technology, to identify people who may be at risk of offending in their stores or engaging in bad behaviour. So offending might be things like stealing from the store or other forms of violence against workers, but it also stretched to things like bad behaviour like swearing or some kind of perceived aggressive activity in the store or antisocial behaviour, we might say. And what the system...
Including streaking as well, by the looks of Bunnings...
which leads to the
inevitable joke
that it's not clear that you need facial recognition technology to identify someone who's streaking. Or indeed, there's an image of somebody with a balaclava going in with a machete, which is obviously...
Again, no good for FRT.
Yeah, extremely dangerous situation, but no, not really clear why FRT is relevant in those circumstances. But the idea or the practice was that it would collect images of people coming in, hold those images for a very small amount of time, kind of milliseconds, to run them through their database, identify whether they matched a list of people that were on this list of people who'd engaged in bad behaviour before. And if they didn't, the image would be deleted. So Bunnings said we don't collect information because they didn't think that that satisfied the definition of collection. And then it was reasonable to use this because of the serious threats. I mean, it's more detailed than that, but I'm giving you a summary at 10,000 feet. And in essence, what the Commissioner has said is that is collection of personal information, which I think is logical. Even if you only hold it for a short time, it's definitely comes under the Act as a form of collection. And that the reasonable belief that Bunnings claimed it had that this was necessary for the purposes of managing this kind of bad behaviour in the stores was not justifiable. There is some interesting discussion in there about how the system worked, including there's an oblique reference to the fact that this was potentially mixed, the database, with other images from police forces to be able to potentially, I suppose, preemptively identify people. It's not clear. And there's bits that I would be interested in finding out a bit more about. But in general, the overall scheme was found to be unlawful, and they have been ordered to stop by the Privacy Commissioner. Now, there was a consent notice, but it was in the back of the store. There was an argument that Bunnings put forward that if we put a consent notice front and centre, that may have be a different scenario, but that's not where the Privacy Commissioner landed. She did say that those kinds of procedural things were not satisfied, so the appropriate measures for obtaining consent. But even if it was, there's a question around, for the Privacy Commissioner at least, whether it was reasonable to have this kind of database. And I think that is the really interesting part. There's obviously risks to workers of people who engage in bad behaviour. And one of the solutions put forward is to take images, facial images of everybody who enters the store in the hope that you might be able to identify people who engage in this kind of behaviour that puts workers and other customers at risk, and whether that's justifiable through a privacy lens. And I think the answer is no. She talks about some other mechanisms that were available to the retailer to protect against the threats that they identified, and also the consequences, I suppose, of assuming everybody is a suspect and running them through this system. Bunnings has come out on the front foot and said that they need this system to do this kind of work, and released some images of what kind of conduct we're discussing here. And it includes the streaker, but things like the man with the mask on and the machete. And I would say, I think the Privacy Commissioner has been very clear that she's alive to the fact that there are very serious threats to workers. So it's not that that kind of conduct isn't justifiably managed and may in fact involve privacy interferences, but the question is around the use of this kind of technology that involves very sensitive information, biometric information, and collecting vast amounts of it about people who have no reason to be cast under any suspicion of engaging in this activity. I think there's also other implications we can talk about if people are interested, including what happens if you end up on that list for, say, swearing. Arguably an antisocial form of behaviour, but hardly something that should get you excluded, I think, from all stores for forevermore. And this process of using these kinds of systems to gradually exclude certain kinds of people from all sorts of spaces, is it a denial of your rights to not be able to go to a Bunnings? I mean, query that. But the point is, writ large, sometimes I wonder about these systems as being a way of further entrenching kind of divides between people and excluding people from society, because you do start to wonder what kinds of conduct then become criteria for getting on that list for exclusion and refusal of service, and whether, if all sorts of retailers start using this technology, what does that mean? There's a philosophical question there that I think is interesting. The other thing to note is that there was also a complaint made against Kmart, which has yet to be resolved. So that's still ongoing, and it's not clear when that will come down, but it's very similar setup, I suppose, it seems to me, although, I'll have the benefit of the decision when the Privacy Commissioner makes it. And she does make reference to a couple of other things, including use of FRT at things like stadiums and the like, and whether those risks are different. And it's possible that she'll find differently in relation to those kinds of things in the event that a complaint like that is made. So, yeah, an interesting decision. I think it is important for us to grapple with some of the invasive nature of this technology and whether it's justified in using it in everyday settings.
Dan, you're a regular Bunnings customer as you do your home renovations. Are you happy with just having a couple of seconds with your face being put through the filter?
No, not at all. I think I've got several problems with this, but the fundamental problem is when is it ever going to be okay that because there is bad behaviour from a small number of customers? I'm not dismissing the risk, by the way, but the idea that every single person who enters a Bunnings store has to be under surveillance because of this small number of people is madness. I mean, I've said this before. I just think facial recognition technology should be outlawed except in extraordinary circumstances. There's no way of gaining appropriate consent for this either. By the way, it's not like, I mean, this is the problem with the concentrated market that we have in Australia typically as well. It's not like there's 1,000 other hardware stores that you can go to around the country if you don't want to be surveilled. So the ability to gain consent is sort of forced on the consumer in any case. But I looked at the video that Bunnings released in defence of this, and look, there were some horrific acts from people coming into Bunnings stores which are indefensible. But the idea that you are then going to take a photograph of every single person that comes into the store and that will just become a new norm, and we're all supposed to accept this. I mean, I fear that FRT is just going to, if this is acceptable, this is going to be deployed by every major corporation or retailer around the country. And it's just a continuing moving of the goalpost where we're already surveilled completely online, and that norm has now been established where most people are comfortable with it. We're then going to become comfortable with being surveilled in the real world as well. And it's just, I think we have to just absolutely say no to this. And then just one last point. Bunnings made $18.97 billion in revenue last year on earnings of $2.25 billion. Surely you just employ more security guards to deal with this. Surely that is a better remedy than surveilling every single Australian that goes into a Bunnings store. I don't know.
Yeah, we'll go one step up in terms of the system, but the purpose of the system is what the system does. So, retail is the exemplar in automation, particularly moving away from a human marketplace to where humans serve you, to automated checkouts. Then they need to put in all the surveillance to stop people doing the 5-finger discount because they're starting to resent the fact that the supermarkets don't have people in there anymore. The unions are actually supporting facial recognition because of threats of customer violence. So we've created this dystopian cycle where the technology's caused the problem of breakdown of trust in a retail setting, and the solution is more technology to monitor people, not just those that have done wrong, but everyone. So, Miah, how do you look at this from the sort of the broader systems perspective?
Yeah, I mean, look, I do find myself agreeing in many ways with both Lizzie and Dan. The need for a response to be both reasonable and proportionate is really clear in this situation, and it brings up ideas of the issue of using private sector companies. I mean, there's a separate issue with government doing this, but I just want to narrow this down into private sector companies using sensitive information about people and technologies for disruption and deterrence without any then further criminal proceedings, or, so using facial recognition to, as Lizzie said, kind of exclude or segregate groups of people without necessarily going down a path where that is evidenced and brought forward to a court. So I think there's a really clear problem with that. I think there are some really similar issues in disruption in the government space, but in this particular example, we're talking about Bunnings. I completely agree with Dan. A security response, a larger security response would have brought about an actual response to those, the violence and the aggression that they're talking about as a concern, without what I think we all agree is an unreasonable level of surveillance for such a small group of people. The hiring of more security guards would have kind of, at least gone some way to both identifying those issues, the streaker, a balaclava, and actually being physically present to resolve them. The facial recognition technology doesn't do that. Obviously, it's not physically present. I really think this is an issue in a range of other settings. I know for a long period of time there was a camera outside the Qantas frequent flyer lounge in the international terminal in Sydney. You weren't able to opt out of that in any way, and the Qantas obviously also has your government verified biometric data. So I think there's some really interesting, which is a part of the reason their frequent flyer membership is so valuable. From a corporate perspective, not for the user. And so thinking about this kind of shift into different public spaces, I completely agree with Lizzie. Like, that's a huge challenge in normalising that behaviour. So I think it's a very interesting determination, and I'll look to see how the Privacy Commissioner then handles a range of other situations, the Kmart example, also in other public spaces.
Just one last quick point, if
Lizzie,
I could.
Sorry, I was going to do but you go, Dan.
Sorry, Peter. One last quick point, which I should have said earlier. The other troubling thing about this is, just imagine if the government was doing this. If the government was doing this at state-owned or federal-owned facilities or whatever, or places, and surveilling the population, there would be an outrage. Yet because these private companies are doing it, they seem to be able to get away with it because it's seen as being in their own domain. But the problem is that those private companies have increasing power in Australian society. And I just think if we don't stamp this out now, it risks becoming a norm across society as a whole, which is going to be irreversible. Anyway, sorry.
And we also just haven't considered how effective the technologies actually are at achieving their goals. So we haven't considered the bias. We haven't considered issues in actually determining, even in the highest end government systems, facial recognition technology, the accuracy isn't always that high. So we really want to be sure that we're also considering how useful and accurate the technology itself is.
I mean, I don't want to butt in here and say somebody think of the lawyers, but I would say there was a lawyer excluded from a Girl Scout trip to see the Rockettes in New York City because she was accompanying a bunch of Girl Scouts because her law firm was involved in a personal injury case against Radio City Music Hall, the relevant theatre that hosts the Rockettes, right, using facial recognition technology. I think the idea that they will not use this for all sorts of things they don't want people in their store for, it becomes like it's not just fantasy. They are already, companies are thinking about how to exclude people they don't want in their theatre. And that is not just people who are at risk of engaging in violent behaviour. That is, of course, part of it. But the scope to allow this kind of technology to be used for that purpose will just see an expansion. And I mean, that would have been humiliating. Like, I can see myself excluded from a large number of places as a class actions lawyer if I end up being subject to this technology. But the point is, we have to set limits. That sometimes companies behave like toddlers. They need limits in order to behave well. And this is an example of it. And so I'm really glad she made this intervention early, because you don't want to get to the point where it's used in these really inappropriate ways without justification, but it takes ages for us to find out about it. So it's not.
And also the
fancy,
2 year time frame on actually getting the determination, which says, I think, a bit about the resources behind these. Okay. Yeah. One final thought, and I've totally lost the clock. We did some research a year ago with a facial recognition simulation saying that your face could determine whether or not you got into a concert, or and people were not so much outraged at that as trying to get their face to look like it was the sort of face that would get into a concert. So we just got to be careful that we don't just normalise this and have people just say that it doesn't matter, it's not affecting me. That just was a bit of pause for reflection. Dan, I'm going to kick it along. And this is in keeping with trying to look at some good news this week. What does Trump's victory mean to your crypto portfolio?
I think framing Trump's victory as good news is problematic, to say the least. It's been good for crypto, that's for sure. Look, there's been lots of speculation about what a Trump presidency is going to mean for tech in general. He's promised to repeal Biden's AI executive order, which puts some pretty sensible guardrails on the development of AI technology. So that's pretty concerning. His vice president, J.D. Vance, has, however, praised the FTC's Lina Khan. So she may continue in her role. I mean, probably not, but she may. But either way, I think the cases against Google and Facebook are and others are likely to continue. I think that's a good thing. And he's also proposed to rework Section 230, although he's been pretty vague on how he's planning to do that. And so who knows whether we're going to see any benefits or not there. So look, I guess in summary, what Trump means for tech is a bit of an open question, because it could go either way. As ever, Trump is pretty unpredictable. But what I want to focus on, Peter, is what Trump means for crypto. And as usual, I'm going to lean into my tech pro persona here for a second, and Lizzie can tear shreds off me in a second. But Trump has promised to be the most pro-crypto president in history. So he's pledged to prevent the federal government from selling the crypto assets it acquires, usually from criminal organisations, and also called to have a crypto stockpile, primarily in Bitcoin. He said he would fire the crypto skeptic Securities and Exchange Commissioner Chair, Gary Gensler, and he'd push for the US to dominate crypto mining, or Bitcoin mining. I think that's going to be pretty difficult unless they get pretty significant renewable energy into the US system. And since his election, the price of Bitcoin has surged to around 92,000 US dollars, which I think is as high as it's ever been. So it's been a huge boon. But look, the reason that I wanted to talk about this is we actually have a pretty good idea, I think, of what Trump is going to do with, or Trump presidency is going to do in regards to crypto assets, because there's already been quite a lot of legislation which has not made its way all the way through the system in the US, but which has got us a pretty good idea of what's going to happen. The most significant piece of legislation is the Financial Innovation and Technology for the 21st Century Act. It's a bit of a mouthful, but that sought to do really sort of one to two things. It basically sought to clarify whether crypto assets are classified as commodities or as securities, and in most cases it would seek to classify them as commodities. Now, there's been lots of debate about whether that's a good or bad thing. I think it is a good thing, because what it will mean is it will make it easier for money to flow into the system. Currently, at the moment, in order to be able to invest in crypto assets, you typically have to buy Bitcoin and then use that Bitcoin to then purchase a crypto asset. I think in moving this direction will make it easier for people to just use fiat currency to be able to buy crypto assets. And the benefit of that is I think we're going to see a huge amount of innovation. Decentralized autonomous organizations, which are a sort of a new form and I think potentially better form of organizing companies, are likely to take hold, and we're likely to see a lot more practical applications, particularly with ETH in the digital trading world. So, look, the upshot of all this is there's a reason that Bitcoin has surged, and that is because we're likely to see a huge amount of money going into crypto assets. I've said this before. I think that the potential for trading digital goods is substantial. Ironically, though, this could actually end up being a bad thing for Bitcoin. There has been some minor speculation about this in some corners, where because of the fact that crypto assets in general are potentially going to become much more mainstream, the one that is most dominant, which is Bitcoin, might end up becoming a bit of a smaller player in the overall grand ecosystem, and so we might see the volume or the value of Bitcoin decline over time. But I guess time will tell. Anyway, on the whole, I think there's a good reason why the crypto world is pretty excited about the Trump presidency. It's probably one of the few things that I think is going to be a good thing about his presidency. So you can tell me all why you disagree with me.
No, I'm just really curious about how the exercise of what's left of American geopolitical power is the play to support the rollout of this as a sort of default secondary currency globally. So your 1 in 7 Americans with crypto are just going to make easy money, and so that's their return on investment for Trump. Is that what's going on here? I don't know, Miah or Dan, if you've got.
Sorry, last point, and then I'll shut up. I don't think that's the case. I think what we're going to see is, I think that because crypto assets are a genuinely new thing, they don't fit easily between a commodity or a security, and the regulation around those things are very different. And so I think in seeking to clarify where crypto assets sit on that spectrum means that we're going to see more money going into the system, and just therefore more innovation in the system broadly. And that's where I think the benefit's going to lie, less around the cryptocurrencies and more around the practical applications of crypto assets.
I mean, you say more innovation, but also surely more just straight up criminal conduct. Like Sam Bankman-Fried, for example, is now serving 25 years in prison for stealing billions of dollars from people or engaging in behaviour that on a normal regulated exchange market would be considered illegal, was in this circumstances under fraud. But it's a less regulated environment than publicly listed companies trading on the stock exchange, right? And so there's this, it's a magnet for really terrible behaviour. And I just wonder whether that's far too rosy a picture of what's likely to happen. Isn't this potentially just a green light for all sorts of wild behaviour to unfold? Like, it's like if you want to engage in a bunch of risky investments and rip people off and not make proper disclosures, you're now on track to do that. You can do that through crypto. Like, I wonder, I mean, I don't know, this is all speculation and I'm hardly an expert on crypto, but I wonder whether Bitcoin will come out on top out of this, because it is, of all the cryptocurrencies, the one that is the most reliable in the sense that it depends on certain forms of mining, and there's a whole question around whether there's an environmental impact in relation to that is sustainable. But there's some argument that it's a more transparent form of generating coins than others, right? So it may end up being the one that is the least volatile in an extremely volatile market. And I just wonder if we're just going to see a whole new generation of people engaging in behaviour like Sam Bankman-Fried did, but without the relevant consequences. I think this is just going to introduce a huge amount of volatility into the US economy that the harm is likely to be suffered by the people who have the least. The whales are looking after themselves. That's why they're celebrating with the president. They're seeking a return on the investments they've made, and they don't care at all about the tiny little minnows who have, bet their farms on this form of wealth generation. And I just see this as a method of redistributing resources away from poor people towards rich. That's how I would see it. But I think there may be some innovation as a result, but there's just going to be a monstrous amount of volatility.
Yeah, I mean, I'd agree with the volatility. It's hard to see how people like Trump and Elon would be not trying to ride this hype cycle and sell at a really high point, making an incredible amount of money for themselves. And, as Lizzie said, that increasing such volatility into the US market won't bode well for the, millions of kind of regular Americans. I don't think this is going to have an equitable and positive outcome. Crypto's often sort of advertised as something that's shopping around for a bit of a real cause. And I don't think that this is going to help find that cause. I think what we're going to see is the people that have invested and are creating the hype cycle around this, they're going to make a lot of money out of it.
I think you might be right, by the way, when it comes to cryptocurrencies, which are more like securities. But I think one of the main benefits of the Financial Innovation and Technology Act is that it is actually going to bring some regulation where there is none currently. And I think what's really important for people to realise is that crypto assets are more than just cryptocurrencies. They also have the ability to create smart contracts, to create decentralised autonomous organisations, which are good for potentially not-for-profit organisations forming and a superior form of a constitution, for example. So I think, yes, it potentially removes some of the barriers for cryptocurrencies, which might result in some of those bad outcomes that we're fearing. Although I would make the point that in Sam Bankman-Fried's case, it was pretty blatantly fraud, regardless of whether it was crypto assets or anything else. But for those assets that are classified as commodities, I think we're going to see much more innovation in that space. And in order to be classified as a commodity, you can't operate as a security. You have to have a decentralized system where there's not one person controlling everything to their own end. So I think that we're actually probably going to see the opposite of what you're both fearing. But who knows? I guess time will tell.
Anyway,
let's revisit.
The upside is we could probably turn this into a crypto podcast, which seems to get all the listens anyway.
It's already boring enough. Sorry, folks.
Look, finally, I just want to pose a provocation, which is whether the proposed social media ban could not be not so awful after all. I know it has bipartisan support of the major parties, so it's presumptively bad. I know no one knows how it's actually going to work. I know that over 100 child safety experts have said it's the wrong approach. And I know that even a government-run committee released this week could not find its way to endorse the proposal. But if it is passed into law, some positive things will need to happen. First, if there is to be age verification, it's either going to need the significant privacy protections we've been banging on about or some form of user-controlled data signature, both of which are probably overdue. It's already forced Instagram to wind back a lot of its surveillance and offer privacy controls. And if anyone is using any platform, it's full of ads of Instagram saying we now have a product for kids. So it's changed the behaviour of one of the major players in an effort quite brazenly to avoid the ban. And I thought most heartily the government has stapled a broader concept of duty of care to this package around online harms. Last week, Michelle Rowland gave a speech to the hotbed of radicalism, the Sydney Institute, where she said the government would bring Australia into line with UK and EU approaches where platforms have to take reasonable steps to prevent foreseeable harms, underpinned by risk assessment and risk mitigation and informed by safety by design principles. So my question for the panel, maybe starting with you, Lizzie, is if the shift to tech populism, which is occurring, obviously brings us privacy, secure ID, better platforms and enforceable responsibilities, then shouldn't we hold our noses and maybe bank this as a win?
I mean, obviously, I'm going to disagree with you on that front as to the
That's why-
causes of their behaviour as well as the potential outcome of this policy proposal being introduced. Like, I agree with you. It's interesting to see social media companies make changes to their offerings, particularly for young people, in anticipation of the question is what? Is it the proposed ban, or is it in fact, for example, the proposed Children's Privacy Code, which is currently tabled before the Parliament? The proposal for that would be that the relevant regulator, the Office of the Australian Information Commissioner, would develop a code over a period of time that would be probably similar to what occurs in the UK, which achieves a similar outcome. And I think that may be one of the reasons why this offering has come about by various social media companies. So I query whether I accept that they should have probably done this earlier, but I'm not sure it was the ban that created the change in their conduct. So there's other ways to do it other than a ban. I also think we should be extremely concerned. We just talked about preemptive kind of surveillance without a justification in retail settings. Well, this will involve interferences with privacy of all Australians to determine their age and therefore eligibility to access social media. So an enormous interference with privacy. Now, it's small scale, right? But it has big implications because that's a then data set that's potentially accessible. We have not seen privacy reforms accompany, for example, our digital ID regime, even though we were advocating for that as a civil society organisation, and we weren't alone. There were many people saying that was important. So I don't think we can assume that privacy reform will happen to facilitate this interference with privacy being somehow more secure or more in control of users. We're going to see a mass interference with privacy that will create cybersecurity risks for everybody, not just for people for whom this policy is directed at young people. And we also risk, of course, increased harm for young people. The reality is social, for the reasons, that you put, which is lots of young people access social media to identify the fact that they may be experiencing bad behaviour. They find community. They're able to identify what's happening to them may be wrong and find help. So there's all sorts of ways in which social media is a facilitator of well-being for young people that we shouldn't pretend does not occur or is somehow a consequence that we can tolerate without thinking about further. So what I would say is I think there are much better ways to hold tech companies to account for the harms they cause young people, which are real and undeniable. And I, in fact, think those harms are experienced by older people as well. So the argument is that what we need is a baseline improvement of that ecosystem for everybody, not just because adults deserve it too, but also when young people come of age, we don't want to just throw them into a disgusting environment where we expect them to sink or swim. So that's what I want to focus on, improving the environment, not just creating prohibitions that defer that more important ecological work for the information ecosystem. And it's disappointing to me that kind of populism is being pushed. I think also the polling suggests that there is support for this. We've worked on this with you, Peter, but I think people do understand that there's some nuance around how you manage privacy and safety in the intersection of the two, and that we could do better than a ban. So there's public support for that too.
My thing is, I just feel that we've got this moment where you've got such strong support for the ban across Parliament, amongst parents, that to just end up standing in behind it rather than working about how you can take that wind and kick behind it is this opportunity. I know you've written about this, Miah, about the ban being a catalyst for a broader conversation rather than something to either support or oppose.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I share many of the concerns that Lizzie just raised, and prior to this ban being proposed, I certainly wasn't an advocate of bans. I'm not an advocate of bans. I've written extensively about not banning TikTok, I ultimately think banning consumer applications from Australians is largely undemocratic. I do think it is pretty clear that there are situations where young people don't have necessarily the skills and capabilities yet to engage in social media. And I'm not saying that they're not capable. I'm just saying that particularly younger young people, their brains are still forming, and we don't actually know the impact of extended social media use. That's not to say I think that we should ban it. I'm just saying I do understand the argument. And I've written essentially kind of coming in behind Julian and Grant's analogy of water safety, because I think one of the things that's really lost here, I wrote a column a little while ago for Lowy Interpreter, basically arguing we should aim a lot higher. We should try and export something for regulating social media that actually makes the space safe for young people. Yes, bans of a certain age, I think, are going to happen, but as you said, what happens on the other side of that gate when they come of age? And, whether it's 14 or 16, we need to actually have a safe place for them to come into, because unlike something like tobacco, which is clearly negative and was banned, that there are lots of positives, for people in rural areas, for young, whether they're gay or lesbian people, for people that just don't have access to ready community or information at their fingertips. So there are lots and lots of positives in communities online. And I think that banning something where there's, just outright avoids the opportunity to work with young people who also have incredible ideas about how they can create safe places. Making sure they're actually a part of the conversation is really important. And continuing to work, I think, globally with a lot of other regulators and multilateral forums to try and create safe spaces for adults. I'll just sign off because I also want to add, as you said, Lizzie, the worst thing I can think of is that we ban young people and then force them to watch their social media addicted parents on phones. So I really think when you look at the average social media use in Australia, when you look at the average phone screen use in Australia, it's not just young people. And I think it's something like, I haven't got the stats to hand, but a significant proportion of Australians currently say technology doesn't make their life better. And so what we don't want to do is ban that for young people and have them sit there staring at, hollowed out older people looking at technology.
Shall I jump in, Peter?
Yeah.
As usual, I'm surrounded, but I am in support of this ban. Also in support of TikTok being banned for what it's worth. Well, actually not TikTok being banned, but at least being forced to divest from ByteDance. But that's a separate issue. Look, I think that I totally acknowledge all the benefits that social media has that Lizzie ran through earlier, and I think you touched on some of them as well, Miah. That they certainly exist, they're certainly there. But in my judgment, I think that social media is a net negative for kids. And I guess I've just been hugely...
But it's a net negative for everyone.
Well, it might be, but I think that adults are better placed to be able, better equipped to be able to deal with it. Again, notwithstanding your point, Miah, that staring at their parents watching on their phones, scrolling on their phones is probably not a great outcome either. But I think there's more we can do on that space as well. I think it's almost a separate issue. But I think it's a net negative for kids. And the problem that I've seen is that we have done our best, and I've heard this story from many parents, by the way, we have done our best to restrict our kids from going on social media. My daughter's 15. Earlier this year, we recently we relented and said that she was allowed to go on Snapchat. And the reason for that was because everybody else was on Snapchat and she was being excluded from social events and activities as a result of it. And so in our judgment, that was a worse outcome than her being on social media broadly. And I think the benefit of this bill is that it just resets a law and a norm where it's going to be that pressure is going to be significantly reduced. It won't go away. Of course, young people are still going to find a way to access this. Young people still find a way to drink underage as well, by the way. There's plenty of cases where that happens, but it will be far less frequent than it is now with far less pressure, and therefore I'm in support of it. Now, the big issue, obviously, is that you're handing over a whole bunch of sensitive, identifiable information to Meta primarily, and that's a bad thing. And I totally get that. But I think that having seen how digital advertising works firsthand, I don't think that's going to be a substantially different position from where we are now in any case. Because at the moment, what Facebook and pretty much every other digital advertising company knows about you extends well beyond your age, including your interests and everything else. Now, a better outcome and a better sort of order of things would be if the government had some kind of government ID where the consumer was in control of who was able to access that data. Dare I say, a blockchain technology could have a role to play in that working really well. but and it would be better to have that in place first before you exercise this ban, because I think just practically it would work better. But I still think that on balance, this is going to be a positive if it makes its way through rather than a negative.
I just want to really jump in and confirm. I'm sorry, Pete, I just have to jump in that the stats on advertising data points on young people in relation to the pure incubation breach, which happened earlier this year and was on I've Been Pawned very recently, like this month. Up to the age of 13, advertisers will have gathered 72 million data points. It's not going to significantly change the existing data economy by giving Meta or anyone else more information. That information pretty much largely exists. So I completely agree with that argument, Dan. It's really solid. The data is already there.
Mm. Hopefully this would make less data available to them though, right?
You'd hope so. I think a lot of data is already going to be there.
I'm going to interrupt Mia now so we can talk about Mia. So normally we spend the second half of the show, although we're well into the second half, digging into an issue. And I invited Mia along because she wrote a terrific column in the Lowy Institute's Interpreter a couple of weeks ago, which was around the seemingly doomed misinformation laws. And it struck a bit of a chord with me because, Mia, you were joining a link between what you call the 4 key measures that could improve our information environment. Technology needs to be viewed as an ecosystem. Second, regulate privacy. Third, strengthen democracy. And fourth, and I'm really interested in your thoughts around this bit, invest now in understanding the intersection of biology and technology. So there's a lot going on there, but let's start with a bit of the Miah Hammond-Errey backstory and the work you've done to get you to this point.
Yeah, so look, I spent nearly 18 years in the Australian federal government, mostly in national security agencies. One of the sort of primary things that I did before I left government, which was kind of really instigated my interest in what I call the information environment, was that I led the intelligence efforts of the downing of MH17 investigation for 6 months in the Netherlands and Ukraine. And what I saw there was the way that Russian state actors were able to engage in information operations, cyber attacks, but also coincide those with kinetic and physical surveillance measures. Fast forward, I came back and did my master's in Russian disinformation. I did my PhD in big data, emerging tech and intelligence, published my book earlier this year, same book called National Security Disrupted, Big Data, Emerging Tech and Intelligence, which basically was chatting to 50 intelligence leaders and practitioners in Australia pre-COVID about their perceptions on data, intelligence and so on. So, coming from a national security background, I'm sort of an unexpected privacy advocate, although I would say publicly unexpected. I think most national security analysts that I know anyway, and leaders as well, the vast majority are motivated by improving Australia. So I don't think that they are anti-privacy in any way. What came through really clearly in the book, actually, the privacy and data chapter starts with, no book on big data would be complete without talking about privacy. I was kind of a call to myself to be like, you can do this chapter. It turned out to be, a really profound shift for me because I'd spent, 18 years looking at technology and, basically the biggest threats that Australia faces and what we can do, behind, like within government to try and minimise those and obviously detect and disrupt activity that's of physical safety or, things like terrorism, organised crime and so on. I sort of then ran a couple of think tanks activities. I ran the ASPI Information Operations team, which published quite a number of pieces while I was there looking at, for example, CCP influence in the Pacific. I also headed up the Emerging Tech program at the United States Studies Centre, which is what I did right before I set up my own company. So I've come from a really different background, but, the piece that you're talking about draws a lot of those aspects through that experience. So, I've experienced personally, and my team have experienced personally, Russian state information activities. I've seen how they are deeply connected with intelligence and nation state grand strategy to achieve objectives. And so what comes from that is an understanding of why the ecosystem is important. It's very difficult to look at how a state actor, for example, can exploit an information ecosystem, whether it's a platform, like Facebook or general internet infrastructure. And we've seen Russia and subsequently many other actors engage in kinetic activity, using telecommunications infrastructure. And if we look at where we are today, all of our AI infrastructure is now considered critical infrastructure. Most recently, and I'd love to chat to you, Dan, about the implications of Trump rolling back the AI executive order. Now the National Security Memorandum has been put out because the National Security Memo basically raised that bar and said, electricity generation and access is now critical infrastructure, and access to clean water is infrastructure. So those AI infrastructures, I've called them elsewhere the architectures of AI, they are being elevated to national security level protections. Now, I'm not saying that I agree with that, but I am saying that's a really big shift in the scheme of things. So that first point, looking about technology as an ecosystem, and that piece was my closing statement at South by Southwest. So it got such an applause, I thought, I can use that as a column. But the second piece, obviously, regulate privacy. I think we all here agree. The case has been made for itself. Strengthening democracy, this is a really important characteristic and issue for Australia, because I think in many ways we've considered our democracy very similar to the US, and it is in some ways, but obviously we have that origin story from the UK, and of course our own Indigenous history that we can draw on much, much more heavily to create a better narrative about Australia. And I think there's a lot of other countries, particularly in Eastern Europe, that we can look to for creating a democracy narrative that is different to the narrative that we currently have. And I'm highlighting them because many of them, places like Finland, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, they've directly experienced invasion by Russia and have had to, and colonization, and have had to independently create their own narratives to try and counter that. So there's some really interesting places to learn from. The social cohesion issue is a really big problem, and this is where I really see the social media platforms being a fundamental problem, both in terms of the concentration of power, in terms of information flows, data sets, but obviously the capacity to influence and interfere. And that is largely in the ad tech sector, but is across the board on those platforms. And then finally, this investment in understanding the intersection of biology, physiology, and technology. And so this is really about, we've basically allowed technology platforms to enter our lives, be a huge part of our intimate lives, but we're not actually looking at how do they affect our biology, how do they affect our nervous systems, and what's going to happen when we bring in cyber-physical systems? What's going to happen when, the neurotech-enabled MetaWatch hits the market and goes to 100 million users and suddenly we're surrounded by them? So we've thought about this as a concept of when we can step away. And I think of this when I started my PhD. People said to me, well, I just don't need to use Facebook. It's fine. I won't go on Facebook and then no one will have data about me. And I kept, the intelligence community was live to this because they understand the ability to connect pieces of data. That's what they do. And so they could see the problems with letting that level of data collection and analysis be present in the private sector, which it was what was happening, but was slowly being acknowledged. Now, close to a decade later, people are really conscious of that. But back then it was really surprising to say this information being held by tech companies or by, being available at data brokers, this is seriously problematic from a personal privacy perspective, but also from a national security perspective. Now, I think we're really across that, but I think that will also happen in the case of neurotech. The ability to influence and interfere on a nation state level, but also an individual level, is profound as it is, let alone adding new technologies like neurotech, let alone some of the AI-enabled technologies. And that's not to say we shouldn't embrace technology. I'm an absolute technology lover, but I think we need to look at some of these systems coming into our homes in the same way that we've just allowed social media into the homes of our children, like into our children's bedrooms and lives, without saying, hey, we need you to measure well-being. Instead of expanding user like time on screen, let's talk about how you as a company can improve user well-being. How can you improve engagement and reduce some of these activities? And that will, of course, Lizzie, come to things like transparency and encouraging them to engage in that process. But I think that's a huge fight where we're at.
I find your perspective really unique, Miah, because it's not something that you commonly come across as a rights advocate when you talk to people with a background in national security. And maybe that's unfair to the national security community because lots of people share this view, but it's not one that's necessarily put in the public domain. In part, that's probably...
It's not encouraged. Yes,
yeah,
it's not. Yeah, so being fair to them, I think it's not a comfortable place to be.
Totally. So I understand that. And often, the policy debates happen through the filter of parliamentarians who have their own kind of populist objectives, which mean they emphasise national security risks perhaps out of proportion and don't think about the whole ecosystem. But I did want to press you a little bit about it because, at the time of the Edward Snowden revelations, there was a view that the national security establishment was up for this kind of data collection because it provided significant surveillance opportunities. And now it seems to me that I think quite rationally that view may have shifted a bit. It's certainly something that we've experienced where, the question of cybersecurity versus, say, the capacity to surveil, sometimes those two perspectives don't square. Like when you talk to companies about what data retention or data minimization, one of their objections is, well, not only are we, they wouldn't say this, but the view, I think, is that the law permits collection of vast amounts of information because our privacy laws are weak, but also government requires collection of certain kinds of information for surveillance capabilities that is potentially a risk. That's certainly what Optus pointed to as well in relation to their data breach. We've got all these legislative requirements to hold information. That's why we have it, And I wonder whether you think there is a shift there, that whether now national security has moved away from that time of the Snowden revelations where there's a clear pipeline between the private sector and the national security establishment, where their interests intersected, corporate and national surveillance purposes, whether you think there's been a shift in the national security community or whether I'm projecting. Do you think there's an evolving set of thinking around that?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think when the digital revolution happened, the instinctive response in intelligence communities was to bring everything in their firewall. The intelligence community is founded on finding information and analyzing it and turning it into intelligence for decision makers. So the instinctive response for an institution created in a world of information scarcity was bring all the information in, make it top secret, and analyze. The world kept getting bigger and no one kind of went, oh, like this is too much information, until it was. And then they said, it's absolutely not possible. But you're absolutely right. That revelation didn't hit for a decade after that volume of information had increased. Of course, within the community, you're always going to find people who say, yes, we should collect everything, and obviously the US has the absolute largest intelligence community globally and has the capacity to do that in a way that no other intelligence communities have. But even in the US, they've publicly released things suggesting that they don't think that that's a good approach and that the idea or the solution is not to bring the information in. I'd also add another point that I think what the intelligence community saw, 10 years ago, and the reason I raised MH17 is it was sort of the first real global social media investigation. So it was the kind of investigation that included, thousands and thousands, if not millions of data points using social media to try and track and identify individual members of, Russian units and the assets they had and where they were crossing into Ukrainian territory. So that was a really profound public and global investigation. What happened as a result of that is many of the national security community saw that wasn't going to be feasible or preferable to bring that data inside. young analysts, like any researcher, will always say, give me all the information. But as you have more experience in any industry as a researcher, you start to realize that superfluous information is actually not helpful to your analysis. And so it's about understanding, what information you need to collect. Intelligence is about providing insight and providing actionable insight for decision makers. So a lot of public information is actually not useful or relevant. And that's taken a while for people to really understand.
Miah, isn't one of the problems that we just because we haven't had adequate privacy protections, particularly in the US, but also in Australia, there has been no guardrails around governments collecting this information broadly. I mean, I'm just trying to think about what's the best place to start to remedy some of the problems that you're identifying here. And I take your point that it's all connected. But wouldn't you start with privacy regulation first and use that as a basis to establish at least some norms around what data is collected? And that would potentially benefit, not just what the government is doing, but also what the big corporates are doing as well. But give us your thoughts on that. Where do you start?
So I will, Dan. I promise I'll answer your question. I just didn't get to the final point that I wanted to say to Lizzie, which is that what I think shifted the intelligence community's sudden revelation and the general national security community, which is a bit broader, was the balance of power had shifted. So the balance of power had shifted from the nation state to the tech companies. And when that happened, governments became concerned about their ability to govern. And I think that's where we're at now. So I think that concern was very, very real. And the reason I'm raising that is because we are now in a situation where governing tech companies is really complex and difficult. And so whilst, yes, I absolutely agree that, enacting privacy from a legitimate or real meaningful privacy legislation that dismantles the extractive data economy is critical. If we don't do that, we won't be able to deal with many of the tech challenges that we face. But doing that will be hugely difficult. That is a very challenging thing to do. That concentration of power has shifted. We now see tech companies able to offer or withdraw capabilities in war. So we've seen that in the Ukraine. Up to 18 US companies have offered support to Ukraine, some pro bono, some not. The US establishment is alive to the fact that many US companies are heavily invested in R&D, manufacturing, greenfields work in China. And so what would happen in a Taiwan contingency? They're significant challenges. But yes, I absolutely agree with you, Dan. Regulating privacy would help solve that particular part of the problem. But I do think that shift in terms of the technology concentration has already well and truly happened. How we could pull that back, I'm not sure.
I think your perspective on mis and disinfo is also really interesting because this bill that's proposed by the government, it's been controversial for a variety of, I think, quite bad reasons. But I still think it is controversial because I think probably like you, I think it isn't targeting the source of the problem when it comes to mis and disinfo. And that while there's some elements of the bill are good in relation to things like transparency and the ability for regulators to get reports from social media, what I would like to see is greater transparency in the process for algorithmic amplification of certain kinds of content, but also attacking the data extractive business model that makes mis and disinfo so profitable. And, there's increasing reports of how this works. I haven't been able to verify this, but I did see an article posted about a Swedish kind of white supremacist X account that ended up being traced back to someone in the Middle East or Turkey because they were making vast amounts of money by pushing this content. And there's an argument that when you look at mis and disinfo actors, of course, there's serious players like Russia, but there's also plenty of people who are making a buck out of this. And that is a key motivator of this kind of content. I mean, do you think there is a path through where more rational voices, both within the human rights community, but also the national security community, intelligence community, might be able to make inroads into promoting a better form of policy on mis and disinfo?
Well, yes, but I think I would caveat that by saying I think we've securitized a lot, and I don't want to securitize social media to make it safe. I mean, I don't think that's the solution. Although, we have gone down that process of securitizing so much already that it does seem to be the next step. And I would just highlight, when I interviewed the National Cybersecurity Coordinator, Michelle McGuinness, she absolutely agreed that there is no cybersecurity without privacy. So this is not a heretical view, I think. I think this is now fixing what are the security vulnerabilities and the privacy vulnerabilities. Carly Kind, the privacy commissioner, said the same thing to me when I interviewed her. Fixing those vulnerabilities are things both sides of that community want to do. There will, of course, be tensions. To go to your earlier question, Dan, about privacy, the intelligence community, or at least the 6 original Australian intelligence community agencies, are exempt from the Privacy Act. And you would think that exemption in 2024 means something very, very different to the exemption in an information scarce environment that it was, when that act was brought around. So,
to be fair, so are political parties and media companies and small business and just about everyone else. Yeah,
right. But I think when I kind of think about this, Lizzie, to answer your kind of mis and disinformation question, I think we need to step back and see it as an ecosystem, because our information environment, it's 3 things. So it's our information, like content that we actually consume. It's the infrastructure that we consume it on. So whether that's paper, a platform, radio, whatever, and also the infrastructure that goes into feeding that. So, undersea cables, satellites and so on. And then it's also cognitive resilience. And this is where a lot of this social cohesion part comes in. This comes from a military definition, and it's largely originally about protecting our ability to make decisions without letting an adversary get involved in your military decision-making cycle. The reason it's important is that in the current state that we exist in, we are constantly bombarded with information, disinformation that is being propagated either by a nation state actor trying to influence or interfere, or, as you said, someone trying to make money. All those people turning up to a fake Halloween parade.
Sneakers.
Right. Or the fake Halloween parade in, was it Dublin, where thousands of attendees turned up to watch because a company had found that they made lots of money by advertising a non-existent event. I mean, we've got something really wrong when the process is focused on how much money can we make. So we do need to shift that information ecosystem, and that will be different for media companies. That's going to be different for social media platforms. It's hard to imagine how we might do that, but it's something we need to do. We need to get a whole bunch of different people in the room together and go, what kind of information ecosystem do we want, and how are we going to create it? Because we need to do that before neurotechnology comes online, before AI chatbots are constraining our information and stopping us being able to actually check and critically think about the sources. We need to understand our content and information. We need to understand our infrastructure. And we need to understand, and this is where the kind of human biology technology piece comes in, we need to understand how we cognitively respond and interact with technology before we all go and get, Neuralinks implanted. Like, that's something we need to do beforehand.
So we've probably come to the end of the conversation. Thanks, everyone, for going a little bit over. The campaigner in me can't help thinking that as we've been running our little Privacy Now campaign, national security could be, or the whole national security apparatus could be, a massive ally in this. I'm interested, Miah, in how to tap that really significant voice in the national debate to help land the first meaningful changes to privacy laws in 40 years, which won't happen this term of government either. There's a bit round the edges, but the main game will be probably in the first 12 months of next year.
Yeah, look, I think the national security community is, they're quiet achievers. They're not the kind of people that are going to be advocating specific policy, and nor should they be. Like, that's not their role. I do think, though, that if there is a focus on resolving privacy and security vulnerabilities, they'll absolutely be engaged as much as they can be within the bounds of their function. I think, as you say, it's about getting a lot of different allies to be supportive of the action and understanding, unintended consequences. I think there are a lot in this ecosystem, whether you're talking about Twitter-sponsored, propaganda and, enabling state-sponsored information operations, minor policy changes over here can have really profound implications over here, or, in an election or in another environment. And I think that's something we really need to get a handle on much earlier. Ideally we'd have done this a decade ago, but we're here now, so the second best time is now.
Excellent. Look, we'll wind it up there. I'll put a link to your podcast, Tech and Security, in the notes if I get around to putting them up. But look, thanks for going a bit over time, guys. It's been a great discussion. You better run for your flight, Dan. And Lizzie, see you soon. Thanks for being part of Burning Platforms today. You've been listening to Burning Platforms. It was recorded on November 20 on Naarm land by Rebecca Connell. Talk again soon.